Okay, good morning. My name is Danny Miller, and first an apology for the fact that I'm actually not present with you today. I'm actually at this point of time going to be in Romania visiting a student in a remote village, and I couldn't be at exactly the same time at the Craft Council, which is a pity for me because I would very much like to have met you, maybe one day, be able to do so. I think the reason I've been asked to come here is because I come from the discipline of anthropology. But you may not realise that within anthropology there is a kind of sub-discipline which we call material culture studies. And that is specifically concerned with trying to understand the general relationship between people and the things around them in the world. Now, because it comes from anthropology, traditionally those were studies of things like canoe prows, long yams in places like New Guinea and Amazonia, etc., or in villages in India. But today, most of us will also work in places like New York and Oslo, and we feel, everybody is equally entitled to be burdened by some anthropologist trying to investigate them. And I've carried out work in a number of different areas, but including several projects in London. My base actually is at University College London, where we have one of these centres for the study of material culture. Now, to give an example of this, one of the studies that came out a couple of years ago in a book called The Comfort of Things was based on 18 months taking effectively a random street in South London, very mixed population, and over that period trying to get to know as many people who lived on that street as possible. And we ended up with about 100 households. And the idea was to find out about their relationship with the things that they possessed in those houses. Now, when you do that kind of work, you find as soon as you sort of tell somebody that that's what you're studying, you get to hear the kind of assumptions that people have about our general relationship to things. So, for example, people will tell you, or you'll read in the newspapers, how these days, compared to the people in sort of India or New Guinea who have, good, authentic, proper relationships with things, that now we're all dreadfully superficial and our relationship to things are very shallow. Or you'll be told that these days we're all desperately materialistic. And what's meant by that is that we should have good relationships with each other, with people, but we've become in a consumer society so devoted to the things around us and shopping and so forth that we've kind of lost it when it comes to actually deep relationships with other people. Now, my job, as I see it, is to recognise that those ideas exist, but simply to actually go without prejudice into people's homes and study the relationships that you actually do find that relate to pretty much everybody, not any special group of people, just whoever happens to be living in a place like London. And having done that for 18 months, you can start to maybe speak with a bit of authority about these kind of assumptions about our relationship with things. And what I've tended to find is, certainly with regard to, for example, the idea of materialism, that this actually is, to be honest, nonsense. That you tend to find people who are not able to develop good relationships with other people. They may, for example, be lonely, or they may lacking in self-confidence. There are many reasons. Elderly men, for example, are often... But those kind of people also tend not to develop deep relationships with things around them. Whereas people who actually do manage to develop quite strong and sustained relationships with particular bodies of things, it can be making them as you would in a craft, but it can be things of many other varieties, also tend to be the people who actually manage to sustain deep and for them satisfying relationships with people. So actually the two things go together. Similarly with this idea of us being sort of shallow and superficial. I mean, yes, there are many things around us, and some of our relationships with some of those things are inevitably going to be superficial and shallow. But I think that the reason people obviously get into crafts in many cases is precisely because they're afraid of being just like that, and instead they want to develop a relationship which is sustained with skill and with devotion and commitment to a particular artisanal form that they start to develop over time. Now, you could recognise that there's kind of an analogy between that and, say, being a good cook or being a good musician or being good at sports. But in my work, I'm open to people developing these relationships with practically anything out there. So it may be actually that it's to do with, well, let me give a couple of examples. I found a family that was completely devoted to Christmas. They spent almost the whole year trying to collect special things from, let's say, special shops in Alsace in Germany or somewhere that were beautiful Christmas objects. And they spent weeks and weeks preparing Christmas in their home. And on the basis of that, of course, you have all the social life that comes with Christmas. But very different from that was a young woman who had a very intense relationship with tattooing, with the fact that for her, she had a whole series of tattoos, and to understand those, you had to understand how she understood memory to operate, because they were the way she fixed memories, and particularly memories of relationships. Now, somebody else who's interested in tattooing might be completely different, but that's what was significant for her. Now, of course, I'm not saying everybody has deep relationships with everything. There's other people who just have tokenistic Christmas because their family makes them do it. They'd really much rather be on holiday in Spain. Or there's somebody who's got a tattoo because, they just got really drunk once and, they regretted it the next day. But if you're open, I think, you will find that most people do develop these deep relations. Now, given that as the background, if you then come to me and say, well, what way has people's relationships to objects changed recently, let's say, because of recession or because of some current affair, then I'd say, well, actually, from my perspective, these are much deeper, longer-term relationships, and they are not going to change very quickly. It may be something that has happened over 2 or 3 decades, like the rise of digital technologies, where that changes, for example, the difference between is it a technology or is it consumption when somebody constructs a website or an iPod playlist, which may be the deep, significant relationship that young people have today. Now, that might represent a change, but the idea that some other event in the world is going to radically affect, and I think that these things, I think it's unlikely. I think these things come over decades. Now that matters, of course, because, and it's the note I really want to end on, because one of the reasons we discuss these things, both in this format and in other forums, is because we're worried about environment and sustainability, and the sense that the overproduction and overconsumption of goods is problematic for the planet. But what I would say is that we need to sort of separate this into 2 things. It's not that that actually consumption is kind of somehow inevitably bad for people. People find ways of actually drawing on particular elements within that, equivalent to crafts, and which are meaningful. The problem is really one of science, that basically there are things that are damaging and destructive to this planet. And my feeling should be, this should be the scientists saying that, that certain things should not exist. That if a car over a certain size is damaging, don't make them. If goods with certain chemicals are damaging, don't allow people to have them. And it should be that way round, I think, which is also much more egalitarian, that nobody should be allowed to have these things and they shouldn't be possessed, rather than sort of confusing that with some kind of big moralistic idea that consumption is inevitably, as it were, creating superficiality and shallowness. Because what I've tried to suggest is really on analogy with craft, that it is much better to respect and engage openly with people's relationship with things and understand that what one person does through their devotion to craft, another person might be doing through dress or some completely other unexpected area. But if you're open to that, there are very few people in this world who are actually simply irredeemably superficial or shallow.